Well, hi, and welcome back to the Pastor's Podcast. I'm Bob, joined here with Matt and Todd. We are coming to you from Maranatha Bible Church, located in Comstock Park, Michigan. We are continuing our series on common issues which plague every believer. We are talking a little bit about the weight and the sin. So some of the things are weights, not necessarily sin, but they can certainly become sin if not tended to in a biblical way. And then other things we're talking about are just plain sin that we would allow into our life to what Jerry Bridges has perhaps coined the phrase acceptable sin. I don't know if it came before him or not, but I really like that term. There are a lot of sins that we accept into our life, and today is no different. There are this sin that we accept into our life readily there. I would say this is probably, in my personal opinion, with no research whatsoever, I would think that this is one of those sins that I think people struggle with the most to see in themselves, but they can see it readily in others, and they are more than happy to call it out when they see it. And that sin is pride. And it's a sin that I think creeps up on people because as soon as you start saying you're the opposite, which is humble, you've then just become prideful. So let's talk about pride. Very loaded term in our culture these days when you start talking about pride, and we can talk about that too, but let's define it. So somebody comes up to you and say, hey, Pastor, somebody called me prideful. What does that mean? How would you describe it to them?
Well, it's hard having no internal thing to compare it to, so I'll try my best. But kidding. No, I think it's just having a very high, lofty view of oneself. I mean, to really put it into one phrase, it's putting yourself up on that pedestal, and then really, as we've seen, you can kind of trace back to all of the topics that we've covered, and that's kind of the trickle-down effect of pride, of putting yourself up really above everything else in your own mind. I don't know anything.
Yeah, I would agree that it is a desire to exalt self over others. It's a view of self that makes you think you're superior to others. And as you both kind of alluded to, I do think this sin is the sin that pervades all other sins. It's almost like the root sin.
The locus.
The locus of what drives anger. It's pride. What drives judgmentalism? It's pride. What drives gossip and slander? It's pride. What drives a lack of self-control? It's pride. So, in a sense, this is one of those sins that undergirds every other sin that we struggle with. And so, I do think this is one of those topics that we have to talk about, and we have to learn how to mortify that, and then put on the corresponding virtue, which is humility. So, yeah, at the core issue, pride is a desire to exalt self and put down others, which could be other people, could be God Himself. And remember, we've defined sin in general as the dethronement of God and the deification of self. And you could say that that is the same definition for pride. What is pride? It's a dethroning of God and a deifying of self, so that now we look on God and we look on others with an air of superiority to ourselves. And that's what makes it such a grotesque sin that we all have to deal with.
Yeah. So in our culture, so we asked the question, we were kind of, just brainstorming about this a little bit before we came here. And so the prevalency, how this sin is so widespread, and not just widespread and then accepted, but then I would say it's not just widespread and accepted, it's actually promoted, right? And so why is it? So we would say our culture and our flesh. So let's talk about that for a minute. Why is it that this sin is so accepted in our culture and so pushed by our culture, and how is it gaining so much traction?
Well, I think culturally, it's seen as kind of the catalyst of ambition, right? If I'm gonna make a name for myself, if I'm gonna climb the corporate ladder, if I'm gonna survive in the dog eat dog world, I got to look out for number one. I can't be concerned with others because I need to make sure that I'm getting what I need. So it's really,
who else will, right?
right? Yeah. No one else is looking out for me, so
Right.
I need to. But yeah, it's those kind of terms: drive, ambition, seeking to climb the corporate ladder. All
Type
of these,
A personality.
yeah, all of these kind of terms and phrases that have been used as a veil and a covering over what it actually is pride. So I think culturally it's been accepted because it's been given different names.
Not only accepted, but encouraged.
Yeah, promoted.
Like
yeah.
we live in a culture that pats prideful people on their back, that celebrates people. I mean, if you want, take it from the opposite perspective. Is humility a virtue that's celebrated in our culture?
No.
No, not at all. Why? Because the humble person is seen as meek and weak and, no backbone and that kind of thing. And so our culture naturally gravitates towards those people that are self-made, they're driven, they're focused, they're out to kind of market themselves, and those are the kind of people that our culture celebrates as successful. And so, number one, we're battling a culture that encourages this. But you said it, secondarily, and maybe even more primary than the culture, is the fact that our flesh wants this.
Because even if the culture didn't push it, our
Yeah.
flesh would still want it.
Well, that's the reason the culture pushes
Right,
it.
right.
Because the culture is made up of prideful, arrogant, selfish people, which we
Right.
all were prior to Christ. And so what's driving that culture? It's being driven by fleshly people who are dominated by this desire to do what we've just been talking about, make a name for themselves, show the world how great they are, take the world by the horns and, just do it, you can do whatever you want kind of mentality. Well, that's our flesh speaking. And the culture is merely the reflection of our flesh.
That's right.
So what's at the core of our sinful natures prior to becoming believers, and even the remnants of that as a believer, the hangovers in our flesh, what's in that? It's still this prideful desire to want to be recognized, to be known, to be celebrated, to be honored. That's just in our nature. We want people to think well of us. We want to come out on top. We want to show the world how great we are. And that's a sin, a vice that we have to constantly battle. And so that's why it's such an issue. Not only is it in the culture we live in, it's in our hearts. And if we don't slay that and mortify it, it just becomes this dominant thing that controls us.
Yeah, and I think, just thinking the past 10, 20 years or so, what has been one of the rising phenomena of our day with social media is the idea of influencers, right? You have your own YouTube channel, and you're making your name the brand. So it's a career path, if you can consider it a career path, that is really just dominated by making yourself this image to hold up to the world.
Sure.
And see how great I am.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many, particularly, you're thinking like high school kids thinking, hey, what am I going to do when I graduate high school? You'd probably be astonished how many are thinking, hey, I want to be an influencer on social media. And that's what's driving them, is that idea of celebrity. But it's all centered around self.
Wow.
And the culture celebrates it.
Yeah, and related to that is the whole self-esteem movement. We've talked about that a little bit here before. Just what is at the core of the self-esteem movement? It's not to really help people deal with sin in their life and mortify pride. It's the opposite.
Literally in the name,
Self-esteem. You esteem yourself.
You esteem yourself.
That whole movement has been just a disaster for a culture, and now we're seeing the byproduct of the self-esteem movement. Everyone's a winner. Everyone gets a participation ribbon. I mean, this is just the fruit of a culture that celebrates pride. So if you go to the scriptures, you see nothing about a self-esteem movement. You see the very opposite. It's deny yourself and esteem Christ. So as believers, we shouldn't even be talking about self-esteem. We should be talking about Christ esteem. Right? We should be talking about how do we make much of Christ in our life, and how do we fight this flesh which wants to esteem self. But that's what makes it such a struggle in our culture, because everyone is shouting about how great you are, and if you really want to be, secure in who you are, you need to love yourself and esteem yourself. And that whole psychological philosophy has been detrimental, not only to our culture, but when it starts to infiltrate the church, has been very damaging to the church.
Yeah, because you make much of yourself and no longer making much of Christ.
Right.
So let's look at some biblical examples of pride. I had a few written down here. You guys had a couple as well, and I think, in the New Testament, the first one that really stuck out to me was Luke 18:11. And so we would say moral superiority. That's what Jerry Bridges called it. And he said, Luke 18, the Pharisee stood there and was praying to himself, God, I think I'm not like other people. So when there's unjust adulterers like this tax collector, then obviously the tax collector is there and, he's banging his fist on his chest and asking for forgiveness. And so I think we see this, we can fall into this moral superiority where we say, I'm not as bad as that guy. I haven't been that bad before. And you see this oftentimes, and not every time, but oftentimes. I myself didn't grow up in the church. I was saved in my mid-20s. And people who grew up in the church, and they'll get saved at a young age, maybe at 10, 12, whatever, they never really, in their own mind, sinned so bad. So they're like, well, that guy definitely needed to be saved, but I didn't really do so much, right? And so we have this moral superiority that, it took a lot of grace to save that guy, but me, not so much grace, not realizing that the exact same death, which was Christ on the cross, was needed to save both, regardless of where they came from. So we need to guard ourselves from that moral superiority that we see in the Bible. And I think also you could see the pride of correct doctrine, and especially with young guys and older ones who are trying to run a movement, right? And I like that Jerry Bridges has this in here because we would obviously want correct doctrine. We're not saying, hey, believe whatever you want and come on into our church. There is clear, distinct doctrine in the Bible that you have to believe. But when it flows into pride and you start looking down on other brothers in the Lord and saying, well, we obviously got this right and you don't, so you can't come into our sandbox, right? And so we need to guard our hearts against that, even when you are correct. So we're not saying that you can't be correct, but when you're taking pride and looking down on other people, that's when we really need to make sure we guard our hearts against that.
Yeah, a couple other biblical examples since we're giving those. I think we actually have to go back to the beginning what was the first sin? The first sin was pride on the part of Satan. And if we take Isaiah 14 as being a reference to Satan, Isaiah 14:13, it says, you said in your heart, he's speaking about the king of Babylon here, but we see probably behind that is Satan. I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Fivefold I wills there by the king of Babylon, which we think is a reference to Satan himself. What got Satan kicked out of heaven?
I will be like God.
I will be like God.
Yeah.
It was this pride and a desire to set his throne above God. That's how the fall was initiated in the human realm. It was driven by pride. And even once it comes into the human realm through Adam and Eve, what does Eve want? She doesn't want to obey God in that moment. She says, I see that fruit is desirable for the eyes, and she took from it and ate. Why? Pride. I wanted to do my thing, not God's thing.
That's right.
So, and then one other example, since we're giving examples here, I think you can't forget Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament, who was, given a dream that there's a tree that was going to be chopped down, and he asked Daniel what the meaning was, and the meaning essentially was that he's the tree, and his kingdom's going to come to an end. And in Daniel 4:30, Nebuchadnezzar is looking over his kingdom. He says, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and the glory of my majesty?" This is pride incarnate. And what does God do? He fulfills the vision, the dream. He's cut down. He is reduced to being a cow king for 7 years. And what did he have to learn? Verse 32 says, you will be given grass to eat like the cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, you need to learn you're not the king of the world. There is a king. He is sovereign. He is the Lord, the King of kings, the Lord of lords. He is the Most High, and you're not it. And it's going to take 7 years for you to learn that lesson. So you just go even to that example, and you see how much God hates pride and how he is opposed to the proud. And Proverbs 16:18, how pride comes before destruction. So other examples?
Yeah, I think you see it, even the warning in Paul's letter to Timothy, I think it's 2 Timothy 3. He says, but realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come, then he's categorizing these men that are going to come that we should be avoiding. And for the men will be lovers of self. That's the first thing he hits on, is they're going to be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy. You can just see this slew of descriptions, and it says, avoid such men as these. So we know that this is a timeless issue. As long as we are in our flesh, as long as there is unredeemed man, this is going to be a prevalent issue. And Paul's even warning about this. And I love this too, just in this, in 1 Timothy, because you think of Paul, right? And if there was ever a man that was to be proud of who he was, it was going to be Paul. And you even see that Philippians 3, he's kind of giving off his credentials. But how does he view himself? No, he sees 1 Timothy 1:15. It is a trustworthy statement, deserving full acceptance, that Christ came into the world to save sinners, among whom I am the foremost of all. So maybe just a counter to that. We'll talk about how we fight this in a moment, but that was just kind of striking to me that Paul, who was once a Pharisee of Pharisees, Hebrew of Hebrews, tribe of Benjamin, so on and so on, he sees himself as the foremost of all sinners. Yeah. But even you see this in New Testament, just the warnings of pride and just the call to be avoiding such things.
That's good. And in Psalm 50, I think we can end with, and I think this is so great. He says, these things you have done, and I kept silent. This is God speaking to the nation of Israel. You thought I was just like you. And I find that fascinating, how many people think that God is like them, right? We know there's communicable and incommunicable attributes, and so we certainly share in some of those perfections of God and all those kind of things, but we are nothing when compared with God. And yet we oftentimes think of him as like, our warm, fuzzy cat that sleeps with us at nighttime and keeps us warm, like too much information. But the point is
moving on from the illustration.
We have this thing in our mind where we feel like we're relating with God, like the t-shirt back in the 90s or 2000s, Jesus is my homeboy, right? Like we're on the same level, and Jesus was a man just like I'm a man. But we don't realize that we've then created a God in our own image. And that's idolatry, which is pridefulness, because we're saying that I know what God is like. And God's saying, no, you don't know what I'm like, except for what I've revealed to you in Scripture. And we need to be very, very careful how we view God, because we see it didn't turn out so well for Satan when he was viewing God. Yeah. So then why is this such a heinous sin? What is it? So pride, and we said, is kind of the locus of sin, right? It's that seed that goes, whether it's pride or, whether it's autonomy, some have said, like whatever that is, but we know that you can trace all these sins back to pride. And so why is it that we should make sure that, man, we are just chopping this off at the root before it has the opportunity to really grow into our hearts?
Well, I think we need to understand truly what pride is. It's idolatry. It's idolatry of self. So, we can trace all sins, I believe, in some way back to pride, but then you can take that one final step. What is pride truly? It's idolatry. It's making yourself God and bringing God, either trying to bring him on your same level, but really in your mind, what are you doing? You're putting yourself above God. And we can talk about all of the ramifications of that and all the ways that kind of the fruit that's at this root of pride, but ultimately we need to understand that we're making ourselves God. We can call it other names, we can put other labels on it, but at the end of the day, we're making ourselves God, and that is a terrible, terrible thing.
Yeah, I would add to that, what is the focus of the Christian life? So let's bring it home for us as believers. Let's not just talk about culture generically or the world, but let's talk about as believers. What is the goal of the Christian life? Ultimately, it's conformity to Christ, right? That's why we are saved, to become like Christ. We're being transformed from one degree of glory to another. 2 Corinthians 3:18, Romans 8:29 says that he is making us into the likeness, conforming us into the likeness of Christ. So let's ask this question. If that's the goal of the Christian life, to be formed, to see Christ formed in us, when are we most like Christ? So you could probably think of a bunch of words that would, you are most like Christ when you are blank. How do you fill in the blanks? There's all kinds of words.
Sure.
It could be serving, forgiving, loving, kind, humble. Well, that is I think the answer. That is the key answer.
Sorry,
Philippians 2.
Yeah,
thunder.
that's okay. That is the answer. You are most like Christ when you are humble, because in Philippians 2, it's the only place he's used as an illustration in the New Testament. And what's he used as an illustration of?
Have this mind.
Humility.
That's right.
Have this mind of Christ, who did not consider the things of the Lord to be grasped. And so that's, I think, the way we fill in that blank. You are most like Christ when you are humble. So if the goal of the Christian life is to be conformed to image of Christ, then you're going to do that best when the virtue of humility is reigning in your heart and characterizing you. So that then shows you how heinous pride is. If its antithesis is what makes us most like Christ, then its opposite is what makes us most unlike Christ, which is pride, which is why for us as believers, we need to kill that and mortify that sin, because it puts us and pits us against Christ. This is James 4:6. He's opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble.
That's right.
So when we're prideful, we are acting the very opposite of the way Christ acted and modeled for us. And so that's what makes it so heinous.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I find it fascinating that we're not striving after humility, but as we strive after Christ, we will become humble.
Yeah.
Because as we become more like Christ, humility is going to come out of us for exactly what you said. That Philippians 2 is just a brilliant passage,
It
right?
is.
And it's had this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And so we're to strive after to have the mind of Christ, so that we can be like Christ, which means we are going to be humble. But Paul doesn't say strive to be humble so that you can be like Christ. He says strive to be like Christ,
Right.
so that you can be humble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I was going to say too. I mean, not only does it show up, or it's going to prove an opposition with Christ likeness. Obviously, we're going to see that this damages the church. Like if we're bringing this down to the level of believers in the church, how can pride affect our relationship with other believers? I mean, it really touches every facet of it. I mean, we're called the body of Christ being fitted together. And if you think of this building, this dwelling, if one brick wants to go off and be its own building, well, just think structurally that building is going to be less stable because these bricks are now wanting to do their own thing. Same with the body in 1 Corinthians 12.
We could use some extra bricks.
Well, that's true. 1 Corinthians 12. I mean, it's kind of silly to think through, but why does he provide these illustrations? Because these believers are to be coming together, not looking to their own interests, but to be, Ephesians 4, building one another up in love. 1 Corinthians 12, having these gifts for service in the church, so that the members are participating in the way that God has designed them to. So if you take that away, if everyone's looking out for their own interests, then the body life is going to crumble. It's going to disappear.
That's right. So in the last 5 to 7 minutes, just 2 questions. First of all, how do we diagnose this in ourselves? So how somebody listening, they say, okay, I need to know some areas. What are some questions I can ask myself? What's a self-diagnosis? This is kind of ironic, right? The self-diagnosis to see if you're thinking about yourself too much. So what's a good, helpful, paradigm or kind of thinking strategy that you could have to say, okay, here's how I can find out what's actually going on in my own heart? What would you tell somebody who asks you that?
Even just evaluating conversations with others, is it dominated by you boasting about your achievements? Are you continually talking about yourself and just bringing the conversation back to how good you are? I mean, we talk about church life, body life, being selfless, being humble. It should be dying to self and then putting others first. So I mean, I think even just evaluating something as simple as just how you're interacting with, how you're communicating with others, and is it constantly flowing back to yourself, or are you concerned with others' needs?
Yeah, I think another way to say what you're saying is, in every situation, there's one simple question we can always ask. Who am I making much of in this moment? Right now, who I'm interacting with, how I'm interacting with them, what I'm saying, what I'm thinking. There's that single question can quickly diagnose whether there's pride or humility in our hearts. Who am I seeking to make most of or make much of right now? And if the answer is, I want to come out on top, I want to be right, I want to defend myself, I want to be seen as whatever, fill in the blank, you're making much of self. That's pride. Whereas if in that moment your motive is, I want to make much of Christ, how do I represent Christ? How do I honor Christ? How do I be like Christ in this moment? Then obviously humility is going to be reigning in the heart. So I think it always just comes down to that. Who am I seeking to make much of in this moment? And I think that will help diagnose a prideful heart when it's there.
Yeah, whose kingdom are you building?
Exactly.
Yours or the Lord's?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to listen to the words that come out of your mouth, because Jesus tells us that which comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. And so if our words are about us, if our words are about, you meet somebody and they want to give you their resume right off the bat, right? Their credentials, whatever that is. And you can just tell, who are they thinking of at this moment, and who is the most important person in their life? And so we need to be very careful, because, it is really easy just to talk about yourself, because you're constantly thinking about yourself. And so there are times where you might just have to say, I got to stop thinking about myself so much, and how can I interact? So you see people are like, oh, I'm really bad at interacting with people. That's because you're really good at thinking about yourself. So what's an easy way to start a conversation? Ask the other person about themselves. Be interested in what's going on. And I think that's an easy way that we can actually do that. So that was question number one, how do we diagnose this? So now that we know what it is, we know why we should stay away from it. We can diagnose it in our own heart. So now we have to say, okay, how do we now combat this? So we understand what the Bible says about it. We understand the heinousness of it. We've noticed these tendencies in our own heart. So now our final step is, how do we put the rubber to the road, if you will? How do we now combat this thing to make sure that, A, we get rid of it, and B, that it can stay away? What would you guys tell somebody?
Well, yeah, I think Philippians 2, it hits the nail right on the head. We need to be humble. But I love, verses 3 and 4. It says, do nothing from selfish or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. So let me just put that practically speaking. Are you looking for ways that you can serve others in the church? Are you praying for others? Are you praying with others? Are you out there? It's not always just going to fall in your lap, people saying, hey, here's these things you can do for me. Are you going out and seeking things that you can be doing for others, even with, or maybe even especially with, if it inconveniences you in some way, are you still willing to do that thing? And I think that's maybe a good litmus test of, am I seeking to do this thing for that person because I want them to have the recognition toward me, or am I doing it to die to self and to serve them?
Yeah, and related to that is the whole process of sanctification. How does someone change? How do you change from being a prideful person to a humble person? Well, there's those two steps that we always talk about in sanctification. You have to put one off, and you have to put the other on. That's Colossians 3, that's Ephesians 4. If you want to stop being prideful, it's not enough to just stop being prideful. You have to put on the corresponding virtue of humility.
That's right.
So that's the challenge, is to die to self, but then cultivate a heart of humility towards others, where you become others-focused rather than self-focused, or God-focused rather than self-focused. So you have to move away from the pride to a humble heart. So how do you do that? I think studying the life of Christ is critical. I think making sure you're in the Word constantly, because the Word is what the Spirit uses to cultivate this in us, right? So we can't sanctify ourselves. We have to do our part, but the Spirit sanctifies us. How does He sanctify us? He uses the Word to do that. So that's how you make sure that the Spirit is working in your heart. I think it's praying, asking the Lord to help you kill sin, kill pride, and grow in humility. And then practically, I like what you said earlier, Bob, that it's just learning to put others first, and even asking questions more than talking yourself, and putting them before your needs. And so I think those are some practical ways.
Yeah, it's good. One of the things that's helped me out tremendously is having a deeper and more robust understanding of soteriology, like really understanding salvation. And I think specifically within salvation, at least for me, having a deeper understanding of what a union with Christ means. So not just practically today what that means, but how it got to be. So what did it take for me to have a union with Christ? Because it meant that a perfect, holy, just, righteous Savior had to come down and put on man clothing, right? And then die for stuff that He didn't do. And so as you start kind of fleshing that, I think over, especially the course of the last 10, 12 years, really just been diving into what does it mean to actually be saved? I think that, for me personally, it brings you to a place where, man, you were really dead in your sin and trespass, and you were on your way to hell, and God just kind of snatched you out of the flames, and it had nothing to do with you. And so if your salvation had nothing to do with you, as then Paul would say, why are you boasting? And I think it's just very, very helpful.
Or to say it another way, it's pretty hard to be prideful when you stand at the foot of the cross.
Amen.
Right? The only response when you stand at the foot of the cross is utter humility.
Absolutely. That's really good. So, well, I hope that was helpful. Really appreciate being able to go over these sins and weights with you guys. Once again, if you have any other suggestions, comments, or questions, feel free to email Matt. He's taking emails all day. So hope you guys have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you later.